And that's one of my favorite songs, actually, that India Ari song. It's just helps us to bring in some good energy, especially today, because although one of my favorite people is Julia Samuel. And we've only really met really physically once, but
Yeah,
this felt such a lovely connection.
it
But we're
did.
talking about global grief, which is a really tender and very hard thing to be with. So I wanted to bring in some light. So maybe let's just start with just a sense of however it feels comfortable for you. You might not want to go too far inside, but just to feel into something that feels lighter or ah, nourishing, something that helps you in the moment. For me, it's partly just being here, all of us together, and actually letting myself open my eyes and see all of you. And really getting a sense of how more and more we're getting to know each other and connect in different ways. And that sense of co-regulation in our incredible community is such a source of nourishment, and we sure need it. So hello, everyone. Yeah, and we have, Rashawn was telling me, over 700 people now that sign up to Embody Dialogues regularly, and lots more that see it on YouTube. So it's really wonderful spreading out these little tendrils. Okay, so let's start with Rashawn. We're going to spotlight Julia and I like we do, and then we'll come back to all of you. So you can keep your questions and your comments. You can put them in the chat, and we'll come back to you. But first, I want to really welcome Julia
Hello,
again.
hello,
Yeah,
love.
because you were with us before. I guess it's well over a year ago. I think after we saw each other in Oxford, right?
Yeah, yeah, it was nice
Uh-huh.
to.
Yeah. And since then, so much has gone on for you.
Yes, I mean, not in the level of the sort of collective trauma and grief that's happening around the world, but last year in February, I had a fall and I broke my shoulder very badly, and then that led to a form of shingles that's very rare, actually called Ramsay-Hunt syndrome. So I had facial palsy. So I still got a little bit frozen here, but half my face was completely frozen for about 6 months.
I know.
And I still can't lift my arm. So I took a hit with a wonky face and a bust shoulder, but I got a lot from connection. That's the thing that really helped me.
Mhm.
It
And
really did.
what was so impressive was how you shared what you were experiencing. You didn't just disappear, which lots of folks would do, right? It would be too much to, because you're very public. You've got a huge Instagram following. Huge. It's big. And you've
Mm.
written three bestsellers and you're really out there. And so, many people in their nervous systems, they would need to retreat or they would shut down. But you didn't do that.
No, I mean, the reason I didn't was, I think, unconscious. Um, and so what was conscious was I had a lot of podcast interviews to do, and one or two of them were very kind of breaking news stories. So I needed my kind of conscious thought when I talked to my daughters, because I do the podcast with my two therapist daughters, was I don't want to be the story when that interview comes out. So I need to talk about it first.
Mhm.
Um, and so I was interviewed by my daughters about how I felt about having, a completely kind of frozen face and looking very different and in a lot of pain with a broken shoulder. So I talked about it. And I got an enormous amount of support from my following on Instagram and
Yeah, you
from
did.
friends and family. And so I think, and I really do want to talk about grief and what's going on in the world, but just from a personal point of view, one of the things, there are two things that come to mind right now as we're talking. One is that there is, I think, illness has some shame involved, that somehow I failed, somehow my body failed me, or something is wrong with me.
Yeah,
And I think shame grows in silence.
yeah,
So I think it was a kind of instinctive response that I didn't want to be ashamed of how I looked, and I didn't want to feel like a failure because I wasn't functioning, because I could barely walk. And then the other thing I think is something a term that I came to, which was that there was a kind of, and I don't know if people watching will agree, there's a kind of tyranny of recovery, because why people want you to be so well. There is this thing like, oh, you're looking better, or oh, are you better, or when are you better? And it is really intended to be with love and with healing, but it also is like, oh my God, no, I don't even know if my face is ever going to recover. So I can't do it to make you feel better about seeing me now so that you won't worry about me, because I actually don't know. And
yeah,
and people said to me, what would be better? And I don't actually have a particular answer. Is that rather than saying, I hope you're better, is how are you doing? Is probably an easier question. It's more
it's
open.
open-ended. How are you doing? Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So
Well, I love and I admire really the way that you processed it and shared it. And I remember reading something where you said, so many of my followers share vulnerability with me, and I didn't want to hide that from you.
yes, that was
And
true.
yeah,
Felt
that's really
critical. Mm,
so beautiful. Yeah, it reminds me of, my somatic teacher, Eugene Gendlin, talked about the shaky beings that we all are.
I love that. Mm.
And, we really saw your shaky being. You shared it. And in polyvagal terms, you didn't go to a dorsal shutdown place, which would not have been great in terms of what actually you're describing helped you, which was social engagement and co-regulation.
Was kindness.
Yeah, yeah. And it was safe for you to do that, to share that, because your community are lovely people that
Yeah,
have been drawn to you and your insight and your wisdom and your gentleness, and willingness to share your shaky being. So
exactly.
I love all of that. Yeah.
Yes,
So here we are on I guess your real theme in your work has been about grief.
yes. About I've got grief from death, and also living losses. So
Mhm.
grief from a divorce, or moving house, or a health diagnosis, or having estranged relationships with family members. So it's both. It's both dying and death, but also most of life is about connection and love, and the other side of it, which is disconnection and loss. And the
Yeah,
two are kind of interconnected, the two sides of the same coin.
yeah, exactly. Your joy is your sorrow, as Cahill Gibran would say.
Yeah.
And then there's, the grief of all of what is happening in the world and the incredible pulls and pushes and violence and scary stuff that I don't know about you, but I've never experienced this kind of level of polarization in the world in so many different places, right?
I
Um,
haven't, but also I don't think, that you and I were kind of roughly the same age. I don't think we had access to it, even if it existed. I mean,
yeah.
I think it's so much more visible, and we have so many more opportunities to see it.
Yeah. Mm.
Um, and I think the thing about the collective grief is, even when we're thousands of miles away, we are affected by it. It does, it does impact us. At the moment, seeing the fires in LA, the bombing in Ukraine. I mean, there's wars all over the world um, and I think the thing that is really important is that we bear witness together and we name the loss together and what that means. So what it will mean individually will be very unique and ourselves, we're as different on the inside as we look on the outside. But that so it's highly personal, but there is a kind of shared acknowledgement of that this is a very difficult loss. It's a very difficult time because, of course, if we pull into ourselves and withdraw, which you can shut down, that from the polyvagal perspective means you disconnect from yourself and then you have no capacity to connect to others. And the biggest single protector when we're grieving is people.
Yeah.
People need people in good times. People really need people in bad times. And that it is love, in its broadest terms, that enables us to survive. Love is not a quick fix, and it's not simple, but it is really the way that we survive the greatest difficulty.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Love and connection and community, right?
Yes, but it requires, I think, a lot of psychological sophistication in a way to allow people to have their own particular way of expressing their grief, because they will be informed by their culture, their history, their upbringing, their own story, their DNA, and the support they've had at grief at their times. And I think what often happens is that we want to see how we're feeling in other people, and then we can polarize when we see others don't do what we're doing. That happens very commonly in families. So in family systems, a grandparent, a parent, a sibling dies, and within that family system, it's most likely that people will grieve very differently from each other. Some will be very expressive and tearful, some will retreat, some will pretend it's not happening. And that can cause such conflict in a family, like there's one approved way. And actually, what we want is to name that however you're feeling, there is no right or wrong way. But what actually matters is that we acknowledge that we allow ourselves to feel the pain of it. Pain is the agent of change, and grief is naturally adaptive. So if we allow the pain through our system, however that shows up for us individually, and we find ways of naming it and expressing it, that is how we adapt. And that is how we then kind of in the dual process of acknowledging the pain, feeling it, we can then shift our attention and turn to the light and turn to hope and turn to restoration, where we can get the wherewithal to come back and do the grief work. So it's the movement between the two that supports us.
Yes, I think that's so true. And it's so interesting when we think about the nervous system and how, each of those responses, the sympathetic response of being overwhelmed with the grief, or also getting really angry, right? Some people, it's just so hard to be the shaky being and they go to fight. And then for others, it's shutting down and dissociating because it just feels too overwhelming. And so,
Can I pause
yes.
you? I pause you. So
Uh,
that's absolutely right. So fear, anger, rage, trauma are not naturally adaptive.
mhm,
When you're in that sympathetic state and that heightened state, you don't process grief because it's there, as you know far better than me, to survival. So that you need to find ways of that's code red, the fire alarm is on. And and you can explain this from a polyvagal perspective more clearly, but it's self-fulfilling. So the more you feed it, the stronger it gets, and the more disconnected you get, and more polarized you get. So that if we recognize that and have systems, and I call it like changing gear from fourth gear down to the first gear, then your ventral vagal, and then you can use your wise mind, use your hippocampus, choose what you do, but also you can get enough connection to others to dare to feel and express the pain.
Exactly.
And that's when you're adaptive. So it's this paradox. It's by allowing ourselves to feel the pain that we heal. But when we're in the kind of heightened state of pain, that isn't adaptive. That isn't healing. So it's recognizing that you have to come back into your body, and it is very embodied, that then you can process it. And then you're likely to get up, you move up
Mhm.
and down.
Yeah, and I think I would say it a bit differently. So I would say that those dysregulated responses are adaptive when we don't have enough safety. So if
Yeah,
I'm in an environment where I don't feel in my body that it's safe to connect with my feelings, then going to fight or flight or shutting down is going to help me to survive. But as you're saying, it's not going to help me to thrive. And I'm not going to be able to heal from the grief. I'm going to get stuck.
yes. I completely agree. I guess what the image that I was working is that this has happened after the threat has actually happened.
Yeah.
People get locked in the emotional experience of it when
Yeah.
they're no longer actually in
Exactly.
danger.
They're triggered. Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
triggered.
Exactly. Yeah.
Um, and it's that paradox of grief. Why would I ever want to let myself feel the pain? Because
Mhm.
why would I turn towards it? I want to turn away from it and use everything in my armory to block it, whether it's alcohol or busyness, looking at scrolling on Instagram, whatever it is. But actually, it's the paradox of turning towards it, allowing yourself to feel it and name it, that is what allows you to heal. So
Yeah.
it's counterintuitive.
Yes. Yeah.
Kind of countercultural because, you know, um, we want fixes.
And we're
The
socialized not to feel it, right? We're socialized to carry on and be little soldiers and stiff upper lips and all of that.
Yes, very much so. Um, but also, I was thinking that I think there's an educational piece about what grief is. That, grief is chaotic. It's a very small word that describes a whole world of different feelings, which are both embodied and uh, thoughts and processes and behaviors, which we don't understand. So often people feel like they're getting it wrong, or they have a time frame that they should get over it by now. Or with the collective story, I think people feel, how come I feel guilty about having a nice day when I'm hundreds of miles from where all the tragedies are happening? But actually, it's allowing yourself to be impacted by them. And I think one of the things that helps us most, which is, why I was very keen to do this seminar, is the collective healing from rituals, like
Mhm.
developing rituals together where people, a kind of disparate group of people, come together to
Mm.
bear witness, to build connection with each other, to bond with each other. And the warmth of being together gives us, I think, a boost and a kind of meaning that we are sharing something, because grief is very chilly and isolating and it's disconnecting. So I think we lose a lot when we don't um, really create rituals collectively that acknowledge and bear witness to these different terrible things happening around the world.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important. Yeah. Rituals are comforting, aren't they? They're ways of, it's like there's a lot of predictability in a ritual. And that
Exactly.
predictability helps us to feel safe, um, and that we can count on something, you know, that
And
it's
rituals,
familiar.
exactly. And sort of, funerals
Mm.
um, are the most kind of common that we think of around death. And there's stones here in the UK. There's one called Lanyon Quoit, Quoit, which is 4000 BC. So
Mhm.
it has been a basic human response to death to find something, because grief is invisible. So stones are often part of the grieving process, whether it's a headstone or stones on the grave, or having stones. Or I always talk to children about taking stones in their pockets, that
Mhm.
they make invisible what is invisible, but also it marks and acknowledges the death,
Yeah.
so that this is the place where this person died. And we have that I was thinking in London, we have the cenotaph that marks, the First World War. We have them all over, but I think we kind of walk past them without recognizing that they have a very important psychological role.
Yeah, I think that's so true. So how, I think both of us are really resonating, and so many of us in our community, with this really important shifting of paradigms into welcoming what's uncomfortable, as Gemlin would say, welcoming the grieving, and as you're speaking about how, I remember you said something like the grieving is the therapy.
Yes.
Yeah. Um, and this is just so the opposite of what our culture, white culture in particular, cuts us off so drastically and harshly against embodiment. And it's a terrible thing. So
And
we're
kind of,
really kind of working hard, I know, lots of us, to bring this message, right? That we must come back into our bodies. We must allow feelings to flow. We must connect with each other.
I think, and connecting with each other within an embodied state is where the happens, I think. And also we feel so much and we feel powerless because it is too much. And then we want to kind of yank control because it feels too much. And so it's a really difficult kind of landscape to emotionally let yourself in. And I think it often feels entangled, like a very messy room, that you don't know, if you pull out one thing,
Whole
you're going
thing
to
is,
kind of
yeah.
going to fall apart, and that what you don't know where to start. And I think one of the things that can help is if you focus on one small thing, or you create one 5-minute time frame where you focus on internally or in connection with another, or you journal, or you draw a picture, or you do a ritual. So rather than it being this overwhelming thing, you reduce it to one small thing. I'm feeling sad. I feel confused. You name it, and then you work with one small thing in this amount of time, and then you can build on that. Well, what am I going to do in the next half an hour? So you kind of give yourself an external structure that can contain what feels limitless, which is limitless, really.
Mhm. Mhm. So we're talking a lot about containment, little moments where we can practice really with intention, right?
Yeah.
How to titrate these different nervous system states, and to recognize that we're going to shut down. Because when you think
And that's
about
no
all
bad
of it,
thing.
yeah, that's a good thing. When we're overwhelmed, we need a rest. All of those nervous system states are very helpful. Um,
So
as
it's
long
not about
as
not
we have
having them.
awareness and we don't get stuck. Yeah.
I think the thing is the moving,
Hmm.
and also having the signals and the sort of insight to know where you are within your own nervous system. So for me, I know I clench my jaw and
Hmm.
I hunch my shoulders. So the
Hmm.
minute I do that and
Bring
open my eyes,
expansiveness.
then
Yeah.
in somatic experiencing, in a way, I can then allow another process begins.
Mhm.
But I can have literally a toothache because I haven't noticed that I've been clenching my jaw for hours,
Yeah.
because it just becomes so familiar. So I have to kind of stop, take a breath, like do a kind of body map and then see, oh, hold on.
And that's where, having these daily practices is so important, because if you check in with your body and you make that a practice every day, not only are you building those neural pathways and more ventral vagus, but it prevents you from getting into that locked trauma feedback loop for days on end, because you're checking in with yourself. And in our focusing community, we do that in partnerships, which is really helpful, because then when you're sitting there like this in this sympathetic state,
Someone
your
notices.
partner, your partner can say, Jan, whew, I need you to take a breath.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of intentionality, and also, I think one of the difficult things too is when we were speaking about families, and how when we are, struggling with how to manage all of these things that are going on in the world. I mean, today I just heard on the news that now the peace talks in Gaza, between Gaza and Israel, have been disrupted again, and here we are again, and it's so to be able to have these conversations too with other people, and be really aware of where we are in the nervous system states, right? Because oftentimes people fly up into fight and get really explosive, and other people really shut down and then run away, and we lose each other in these polarizations at a time where we really have to work hard at listening to ourselves and each other, right? Because we're not going to get out of this without that.
No, I think that's true. And where that takes me, and I don't know if this would fit, is that in another way, that's where community, where you can create something like, the song that you had at the beginning is so beautiful, I am light, of people singing together, so that you create a place where that, that people have a role,
Yeah.
but the harmony of singing together, all the evidence around choirs. Or we have here something called park run. I don't know if you have the same in the US, where people on a Saturday morning go to a park and they run a 5K together. So it's like bodies together, movement really, really helps.
Yes, it does.
With others really helps. Walking with friends in silence, occasionally talking. That's why pilgrimages for centuries have
Mhm.
been such important parts of being, aspects of being human, of marking both our loss and our life.
Mm.
Um, but I think that thing of coming together and doing something that isn't discussing what's going on, but sharing our experiences together, is very beautiful. I think music is the most natural place for it.
Yeah, and we're talking here about process, right? Like how to be in process with each other, these ways that really activate a lot of juicy ventral energy, and where we're not talking about content. Uh,
Yes.
and actually, yeah, in Vegas Adventures that I'm doing, is it next week, I think, where we're looking at, spirituality and finding whatever that means to each of us as a person, and how to share those practices together, those rituals, and move away from such content-driven exchange and more into this experiencing. And I think this is just vital right now, right?
Because the minute you get into the content, I think you tend to get into I'm right, you're wrong, or I want you to take on my view. And there are multiple views as there are multiple people.
Yeah.
And so if you can take that off the table, I love the, was it to call it Vagal Adventures?
Vegas Adventures. I'm doing a series of three. And then the first one is on polyvagal theory and spirituality. And Steve Porges actually wrote a very interesting article. If anybody knows Robert, you know that article that Steve wrote on contemplative practices. Anybody can put that in the chat for people. It's a beautiful article, and Julie, I think you would love it. Where
Love that.
it's very interesting because he's talking about how all of these old rituals and practices that you're speaking about, Julia, are in our sort of more rigid white culture, we look at this kind of with, suspect, right? Like, what are these people doing, running around chanting and doing weird things? And so what Steve's saying is that all of those practices really boost ventral energy. And
Yes,
they're not states of dysregulation and craziness. They're actually practices that really connect in with that ventral branch of the vagus nerve and connect us up into social engagement. And so,
and
I
give us
love that
meaning. Isn't there the collective meaning? And it may be individual meaning differently, but I think that the soul energy of singing, lighting candles, community gives you a sense of meaning that is also very kind of ventral vagal, isn't it? It calms you
very,
down. And
yes,
all the research shows that if we can make meaning from adversity, our outcomes are much better.
absolutely, absolutely. So yes, so we have to really embrace, I think, and I love that when you talk about educating, because I'm moving more and more towards educational models. I think there's so much that we can benefit from in terms of sharing this kind of information, particularly about how bodies work,
Yeah,
and coming back into the body and really healing from this split that happened that has really devastated us, I think, as a
I
couple. Yeah.
but I think that the other maybe it's saying the same thing, but I heard someone say once, heaven is being a memory to others. And I think the other part about loss, I think this is different, maybe to do with collective grief, but I think part of grieving a person, someone that you know that you miss, that you're grieving and mourning, is that it isn't about forgetting, it's about remembering. And that idea of heaven is remembering the other person, is it being a memory to others, is continuing bonds, that the person may have died, but the love for them never dies,
Yeah.
that the love continues, and that you can find touchstones to the memory that again are embodied. So it can be you make their favorite curry, or you go on the walk you always did with them, or you wear a piece of jewelry that was theirs, or keep something of theirs in your pocket so that you
People, a
feel
picture
that,
can't see, but this is my friend who died. Yeah.
yeah. So you can have a picture, a photo album, and that those memories and the connection and the love of that never dies. That stays in you and influences you. So you can, and I think that often we forget that with loss, and I don't know if you can link this with collective grief, in that how you grieve makes an enormous impact on your outcome on a daily basis, but also your relationship with the person that died.
Yeah, and the intergenerational grief that our bodies carry.
Yes, so we don't repeat the patterns from
And
generation.
cultural, the grief that we carry in our bodies from losing that connection to those rituals and practices. But that's what we're going to talk about a lot in the Vegas Adventures on Spirituality, and these beautiful ways that we're now coming back more and more. We're learning about this, right? The power of somatics, of coming back into the body, and that we can carry people, and that's all part of that message of like, oh well, somebody died, you have a funeral, 3 days off work, and now you're back and everything's fine. And then in that kind of concept, I remember feeling like, well, I have to keep remembering Jill, because otherwise it's like I've forgotten her and I've abandoned her, and finding a way to
The
be
guilt
with
that
her
brings.
that, yeah, that is really welcoming and saying, yeah, and it's going to feel painful. I 20 years ago she died, and I can talk about her with her kids and I still cry. It comes right away. And I love that.
And they will love that.
And they love that. They snuggle into me because
Yeah.
they feel how I carry her in my
Yeah.
body, right? And so instead of thinking, oh, this has to stop, it's like, yes, this is wonderful.
And that connects to that thing, maybe this is peculiarly English, about I don't want to upset you by talking about it. And I think that links to the embodied collective grief too, is that, I don't want to upset anybody. I'll just kind of manage myself on my own. And of course, you upset everybody far more because you're not, people can tell that you're dysregulated, but they don't know what's going on. But also, all the people that are grieving have told me, you can't upset me more than I already am. I miss this person every minute of every day. You actually upset me by not talking about them.
Exactly.
Grief, in a way, compels us to love more, not to love less.
Yes, yes.
It's honoring them in loving them and showing both the depth of our loss, but also the depth of our love. And so it kind of invites us to dare to love more.
Mhm.
But when we retreat and hide into it, we then, particularly if it's dorsal, we get frozen, and then we kind of narrow so much we can't connect and love. It disconnects us.
It's one of the really tragic things about whiteness. Lots of work to do. Shall we come back? The chat is very busy. I can see people in there asking and chatting away. Shall we come back, Julia, and give our um, community some time with you?
Yeah, sure.
John, do you want to bring us back to the big group? There we go. Hello, everybody. So, anybody like to share, comment? I saw lots of things going on in the chat. How are you all doing out there with global grief? Kathleen is kind of hanging in a little bit, yeah. Do people feel, you feel that in your body? Yeah. Hi, Elspeth.
Do people,
I
do
just
people
saw
want to ask questions, but are people asking questions verbally or by text or
the,
how?
you can ask them by raising your hand and just coming and joining us. I can also have a look in the chat and see what people are saying. Um, hmm.
I think Elsbeth raised her hand.
Oh, did you, Elspeth? Okay, come on up.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you, Julia. That was very, I was going to say thought-provoking, but that kind of misses the point. But when you first, both of you first started to speak, what I was hearing was intention and agency. And what went through my mind was, and it shifted towards the end. So I just want to comment on the whole shift for me. So intention and agency, and what was going through my mind was, what happens when we're considering children who have less agency and may not be so able to engage in intention, and particularly what happens with adults who have developmental disabilities. And I think there's two bits to this. One is what happens to them, but what happens to us when we don't see particularly adults with developmental disabilities? They don't have a voice to even help us recognize that they're grieving too, but we don't see it the same way. So that was the first part, but then you both shifted into this embodiment bit, because my question, the first part was, how do we assist, support, help? But when you shifted into the embodiment, you actually were giving me the answers. So it's about rituals and embodying in other things that can come to represent in some manner the person, particularly the embodied representation of the person. And I think if we were, I mean, I work with people with developmental disabilities. I think if we were to bring on board more of those sort of rituals, because again, they tend to be excluded from funerals. They won't understand, therefore we exclude them. So I think to bring on a whole education about embodiment, and in fact, we may even learn from people who don't use words to express themselves because they're actually in their bodies all the time. And we don't recognize that. But I think you have provided a stage to actually take that perspective and talk more about that. Yeah, so thank you.
Oh, I'm really pleased to hear that. Just to respond to the piece about children and grief, and I think there's still profound misunderstandings about children's grief, and there's this kind of false narrative, which is children are amazing, they're so resilient, they bounce back. And they can bounce back if they are given the support, if they're allowed to feel their pain, if the grief is role modeled for them, if they're given all the information, if they're included in the grieving process. And often we want to kind of protect children. We don't want to upset them, and so they get relegated to aunts or grandparents, away from even now going to funerals or having the opportunity to see the body and say goodbye. And so my kind of main ask of people, or invitation of people, is children need the same invitation as adults, but in age-appropriate language. And children learn to grieve by observing the adults around them. And so often the sort of metaphor for children's grief is jumping in and out of puddles. And actually, I think as adults, we become much more childlike rather than adults. So if we can allow ourselves to be childlike and jump in the puddle, be upset, have a tantrum, lose it, or however we express it, and find a way of expressing it, and then jump out of the puddle and be okay and get a task done, talk more coherently, have a break, do something that feeds our soul, gives us joy, then we can do and go back and do the lost work. And I think often with children, people pull them towards them, go, no, don't cry, don't be upset, it's going to be fine, rather than let them do the very necessary kind of grieving process.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
And I think play and rituals are very important for both children, adults, and people with learning disabilities. Words often fail us.
Yeah, agreed.
Neil. Hi, Neil.
Hi. I got the impression that, see, I don't think it's about intentionality. I think that contradicts polyvagal thinking in a sense, because our states, whether they be sympathetic, adrenal, dissociated and withdrawn, or socially engaged, are adaptive states according to what we are actually processing. And I think as a part of that, I think part of deep listening involves a curiosity and a willingness to embrace our high states of disagreement, of high sympathetic adrenal outbursts, and to be able to be potentially resilient enough to take that in beneath the words. And I always go back to this theme. I think there's too greater compulsion to do too quickly to go back into a ventral state, to name it. I don't think it's about naming it. I think it's about presencing with where we are, and to have slowly the capacity and the resiliency to be able to acknowledge beneath the words, and then that takes away much of the shame and the blame, because we are felt in terms of our listening, and we're listening to another, but we're also allowing for high states of sympathetic outburst and whatnot. So I just wondering,
I think what you're talking about there, Neil, maybe is that's why I made that 7 in the 7Fs, the fired up state. So this isn't about calming everybody down. It's about, though, being able to be with and to expand the window of tolerance so that we can feel intensely about what's going on, because we should feel intensely about it. At the same time, if we don't have the capacity to connect into some sense of ventral, then we're not going to hear anything. So I think it's the more that we can be with what's really intense, because we're in a blended state, the more we can really listen to each other and hold space for intense feeling, which is a part of how we need to respond in the world now, because things are horrible. They're terrible in many ways. So without some of that blending, that's why Fired Up is so important, because if you just go into raging, nobody hears anybody. And then eventually the body shifts and shuts down into dorsal because it's too threatening.
You
But
can
if
say,
you can find enough ventral, I can be with you here, I can hold this space with you, and I can hear what you're saying, as long as there's a measure of respect there, that people aren't hitting each other, and because then they're just flying into rage. So I think the blending is the key, really. And I agree with you. We need to be able to expand that window of tolerance so that we can really be with lots of different, a whole range of experiencing. That makes sense? This is what Gendlin would call getting the right amount of closeness and distance from the felt sense.
Right. I would just add one more thing. I think as part of that is the capacity to lose ourselves in that state, but to have enough to be able, maybe a
come back.
curiosity and holding, to come back. But you have to be willing to lose. You can't recoil. This is too overwhelming. But to have that capacity to lose yourself in that. And I think, and then there's a little bit of something that enables you to cushion the coming back to that and to hold it.
Well, I
In
think
other
it's a tipping point, though, right? Because if you go too far up into flight fight, the body will naturally, the nervous system will respond by going to dorsal to survive, right? So we want to play with that place where you can come into lots of intensity, but at the same time, there's enough grounding there that you can play with it.
right, right.
I think you're both saying the same thing.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, I don't think there's, and my other, I agree with you, Neil, because I wasn't talking about time. I wasn't saying like do this for 3 minutes and that for 10 minutes. It takes the time it takes to express and experience the pain of your grief. But I think my fear would be is if you tipped, in what Jan was talking about, is that also you could get into a psychotic state, and then that really terrifies you, and you don't trust your body, and you'll do anything to avoid that state. So that it is always, I think, isn't it, Jan, holding on to enough, whether you, when I'm really suffering, I hold on to something physical that helps me feel grounded. So I have a stone that I use, and I have a shell. So I hold them, and I stomp, and I rage, and I vent, and I do my thing. And then and I often do it outside in nature. I find that is by far for me the most kind of both grounding and expressive. I don't know, it just frees me being, particularly in terrible weather and things. But having the stone, I use that as my connector back into my ventral vagal. So I think you can have a representation of it. I don't know if that rings bells for you, but that's what I do.
Yeah. Great. Barbara.
Thank you. So many things coming up. One of the things that I value so much, Jen, about polyvagal theory is that it helps me go underneath the words, right? We try to use words to describe what's happening, but the words are really up here. Even emotions are still kind of more closer to the surface than what's going on deep in our bodies.
Okay.
And the value, I guess, of being able to go down, I mean, what you call the felt sense, and those words are so helpful because, okay, what, not, what's that deeper sense, that state? And I'm using words to describe something that there aren't words for. They're really not words for. It can be so profoundly, reparative. One of the things that was going on in the chat is, for some of us, obviously, in terms of what's happening in the world right now, whether we're Black or white or a citizen of the US or a citizen of another country or Palestinian or Jewish, the feelings of where we're coming from are so intense. And I mean, I'm old enough that, yes, I'm white. Yes, I'm partly, I'm part Jewish, I'm part Irish, I'm part English. But I, as a child who survived World War II, my body knows the pain of violence in a way that that I've spent my whole life trying to process, trying to make peace with, and the challenges of expanding beyond our group identity. I'm more than a WASP. I'm more than a Jew. I am a human being on this earth. Just because my face isn't black, my skin isn't black, does not mean I don't feel for those people whose skin is darker than mine. Just because I was born into a fairly well-to-do family doesn't mean I don't want and haven't tried to find ways to bring the safety of financial support and well-being to others who are not as fortunate as I am. We need to be able to listen, both underneath the words and also reach beyond them.
Did you want to say anything, Julia?
I mean, you said it a lot, and I really understand what you're saying, and the sort of power of recognizing our sort of intimate humanity, whatever our identity is as human beings, and respecting and valuing each other, and not using those identities as weapons against each other. And finding a collective narrative that we belong. There's more that we share as human beings, and we're more similar than there is differences, and and you had a lived experience of that, surviving the Second World War as a child, and it's probably been the thing that has defined your relationship with yourself and everybody in your world ever since. So you talk from a very deep experience, and it feels very powerful.
I think, one of the things that these conversations can be very tender, and people can quickly feel intense emotions around the content. And that makes sense. But what I really want us to work on doing is to focus on the process in which we are having the conversations. So the content's important, but the content will not move in the right direction without, I feel, some kind of agreed upon process of keeping people safe enough, have enough ventral energy to be able to really deeply listen to each other. And so that's what I want to really bring today, is this sense of how can we be together and pay attention to the process in which we're together. So when Julia, talks about rituals, for example, and ways that other cultures have BIPOC cultures that have been much more connected to embodiment, how can we get back to the body? Because the body knows how to listen. We know how to listen to each other through the felt sense, but we can very quickly lose that and unravel and get so stuck in top-down arguments about things that really move us up into flight, fight, and then shutting down. So that's what I guess I want to leave us with today. That there's lots of stuff that got stirred up. I read it in the chat. I'm with you. I'm listening. And I want us to really think about and feel into through the body how we can be together in our community and really pay attention to how we're processing and what's happening in our bodies so that we can continue to really honor each other and really try to move through a lot of profound complexity.
Can I add into that?
Yes, please
You've
do.
only got a minute, and I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to answer the people with their hands up. I think what comes up for me when you're speaking, Jan, is that often in grief, collective grief, every kind of grief, we want to make sense of things. We want a narrative that makes sense, because if we can have a narrative, it gives us a feeling of control. And the thing that all of these devastating losses and wars does for us is raise our powerlessness, that we don't have control. And I think if we can, again, recognize the paradox of that there are so many things we will never have a narrative that makes sense, that we have to accommodate. And that's the word I think that's very useful. We have to allow lots of competing feelings, narratives, views, and hold them, honor them within us, rather than trying to kind of take one and make that the winner. Then we come from a much more open place where we can connect with ourselves and other people.
A much more open place where we can connect with ourselves and with other people. Beautiful. Thank you, Julia, for being with us. And thank you for the incredible work that you're doing, and wishing you well in your body.
Thank you. Yes, I
And
hope it.
to everybody, thank you for coming. And, email me, talk to me. But I really want us to take with us this idea, this embodied idea of working on process, how to be together so that we can honor each other.
Yeah, that's very beautiful. Thank you. And thank you, everyone who came and listened and joined and contributed. It means a lot.
Yeah, it means a lot. Always appreciate everybody coming. Okay. Be well, and we'll see you soon. I think, what's the next one, Rashawn? Geez, we're so busy. We're doing a special, right? A 2-hour special.
Wow.
Polyvagal Theory meets the 12 steps. Is that right? In February. And
Yeah, also in February, there's Guy McPherson.
Guy McPherson, the trauma
Yeah.
therapist podcast,
Yeah,
huge.
that's on the 13th. And then the week after is the Polyvagal Theory meets 12 steps.
Yeah, a 2-hour.
2-hour special. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Wonderful. Okay.
All right, everyone, take care of yourselves.
Everyone,
It brings up a lot. So
take
do
care.
things.
Tender hearts, tender hearts. Yes. Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.